I spent 17 years studying apex predators across North America, documenting wolfpack behavior in Minnesota, tracking mountain lions through the Rockies, and analyzing bear feeding patterns in the Pacific Northwest. I thought I understood what made a predator dangerous. I thought the hierarchy was clear: size, strength, territory, hunting strategy. All of it followed patterns you could study, predict, and respect from a safe distance. Then, I had an encounter in the forests of northern Wisconsin that made me realize how little I actually knew. What I faced that night wasn't something from folklore or legend. It wasn't a werewolf cursed by moonlight or transformation. It was something far worse, because it was real, intelligent, and entirely unconcerned with whether I believed in it or not. My name is Dr. Sarah Hendricks. I hold a PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, and I've published over 40 papers on predator behavior and ecology. I'm telling you this not to impress you, but to establish that I'm not someone prone to panic or misidentification. I know the difference between a wolf and a coyote at 500 yards. I can identify species from scat, tracks, and feeding patterns. I've spent more nights alone in remote wilderness than most people spend in their entire lives. None of that preparation mattered when I encountered something that rewrote everything I thought I understood about North American fauna. The encounter happened in October of 2019. I was conducting a long-term study on timber wolf populations in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, tracking a particular pack that had been showing unusual movement patterns. They were avoiding an area they had previously used as prime hunting territory, a stretch of mixed hardwood and pine forest with abundant deer populations and good denning sites. Standard protocol would suggest either human disturbance or presence of a competing predator, possibly a bear or another wolf pack. I wanted to understand what was driving the displacement. I had set up a series of trail cameras throughout the territory, checking them every 2 weeks to document wildlife activity. The cameras were positioned along game trails, near water sources, and at territorial boundary markers where wolves typically scent mark. The data I collected over the first month showed the wolves consistently avoiding a central corridor roughly 3 miles long and a mile wide. They would travel around it, sometimes adding significant distance to their movements, but they would not enter that zone. That avoidance pattern was highly unusual and scientifically interesting. On October 23rd, I hiked into the avoidance zone alone to check cameras and look for signs of what might be displacing the wolves. It was a Wednesday, mid-afternoon, with good weather and several hours of daylight remaining. The forest was mature second growth, dense enough to limit visibility but open enough for comfortable hiking. I had a GPS unit, satellite phone, bear spray, and a detailed topographic map. I had informed my research partner of my route and expected return time. Everything was done by protocol, the way I had operated in the field for nearly 2 decades. The first camera I checked showed nothing unusual. Deer, a few raccoons, a red fox moving through at dawn. Standard forest activity. The second camera was positioned near a small creek where I had previously documented wolf tracks. When I reviewed the footage on my portable screen, I found something that made me stop walking and replay the clip 3 times. The video showed a figure moving through the frame at night, captured in the infrared glow of the camera's night vision. At first glance, it looked like it might be a bear standing upright, a behavior they occasionally exhibit. But the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too broad and positioned differently. The head shape was elongated, canine, rather than the rounded profile of a bear. The figure moved across the frame in approximately 4 seconds, walking on 2 legs with a gait that was fluid and natural, not the awkward shambling you see when bears stand upright. I stood there in the forest, reviewing that footage, trying to find a rational explanation. The timestamp showed the clip was recorded 6 days earlier at 2:17 in the morning. The creature, and I had started thinking of it as a creature rather than an animal, had been walking along the creek bank, moving with purpose and direction. It wasn't foraging or investigating. It was traveling through the area as if it knew exactly where it was going. I noted the location coordinates and continued my camera check, but my attention had shifted. I was no longer just collecting data on wolf displacement. I was trying to understand what could create the displacement in the first place. The third camera showed more footage of the same entity, this time from a different angle. The figure appeared again at night, but this clip showed it stopping mid-frame and turning its head toward the camera. The movement was deliberate and controlled. For approximately 3 seconds, the creature seemed to be looking directly at the lens. Then it turned away and continued walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camera's range. That moment, those 3 seconds of what appeared to be direct acknowledgement of the camera, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October temperature. I had documented thousands of hours of trail camera footage throughout my career. Animals react to cameras in predictable ways. Some species show curiosity, approaching and investigating the device. Others startle and flee. A few show no reaction at all, simply passing through the frame without awareness. What I saw in that footage was different. The creature had not been startled. It had not investigated. It had simply looked at the camera with what appeared to be recognition, then dismissed it as irrelevant and moved on. That behavior suggested awareness and intelligence beyond typical wildlife responses. I checked 2 more cameras and found similar footage on both. The creature appeared multiple times over a 6-day period, always at night, always moving through the avoidance zone with apparent familiarity. The footage showed it walking on 2 legs in some clips and dropping to all 4s in others, transitioning between postures with ease that suggested this was natural behavior rather than something forced or awkward. The skeletal and muscular structure required for that kind of locomotion versatility would be extraordinary, something I had never encountered in any known North American species. By the time I finished checking the cameras, the sun was lower and the forest had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon. I had collected my data and should have been heading back to my vehicle, but scientific curiosity overrode caution. I wanted to find physical evidence, tracks, scat, feeding signs, anything that could help me identify what I was dealing with. I followed the creek upstream, moving slowly and scanning the soft ground along the banks for prints. What I found 20 minutes later made me question whether I should continue or retreat while I still had the option. The tracks were clear in a patch of mud near the water's edge. They showed a 5-toed print roughly 9 inches long and 6 inches wide, with visible claw marks extending beyond the toe impressions. The overall shape was canine, similar to a large wolf print but with significant differences. The toe spread was wider than wolf tracks. The claw marks were longer and more pronounced. The depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than any wolf I had studied. What disturbed me most was the presence of both 4-legged and 2-legged track patterns in the same area. I could see where the creature had been walking upright, leaving impressions that showed only the hind feet, then transitioning to all 4s and leaving the full set of 4 prints. That transition happened smoothly with no signs of stumbling or adjustment that would indicate awkward or unnatural movement. I photographed the tracks from multiple angles, placed a ruler and frame for scale, and took detailed notes. Then, I made a decision that I have questioned many times since. I followed the tracks. They led away from the creek into denser forest, moving upslope toward a rocky outcropping visible through the trees. The creature had been walking on 2 legs for this section, the tracks showing a stride length of approximately 4.5 feet. I estimated the height based on stride and track size, calculating something in the range of 7 to 8 feet tall when upright. That placed it well beyond any known North American canine species and into a size category that should not exist undetected in well-studied forests. The tracks led me to a natural shelter formed by an overhanging rock ledge. The area underneath showed signs of repeated use. The ground was compressed and cleared of debris. I found scat that resembled wolf scat but was significantly larger and contained what appeared to be deer hair and bone fragments. There were scratch marks on nearby trees, deep gouges in the bark positioned 6 to 8 feet off the ground, far higher than any wolf could reach. The pattern suggested territorial marking behavior, similar to how bears mark trees, but the depth and precision of the scratches indicated claws that were sharper and more controlled than bear claws. I was documenting the site with my camera when the light began to fail more rapidly than I had anticipated. The sun was setting earlier than my mental calculations had predicted, and the dense canopy accelerated the transition from daylight to dusk. I checked my watch and realized I had been tracking for over an hour, moving deeper into the forest than I had intended. My vehicle was approximately 3 miles away through terrain that would be challenging to navigate in darkness. I made the decision to head back immediately, following my GPS coordinates rather than backtracking along the route I had taken. That decision probably saved my life, though I did not understand why at the time. I had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I noticed the forest had gone quiet. The background noise of birds, insects, and small animals moving through undergrowth had faded to nothing. The silence was absolute and oppressive, the kind of quiet that signals predator presence. I stopped walking and stood motionless, listening and scanning the darkening forest around me. That is when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate bipedal footsteps moving through the forest parallel to my position, perhaps 50 yards to my left. Something large was pacing me, matching my speed, staying just out of sight in the thickening shadows between the trees. My training told me to make myself appear large, make noise, assert dominance. Everything I knew about predator encounters suggested that showing fear or running would trigger pursuit. But something deeper, some instinct that predated my academic training, told me those rules did not apply to whatever was moving through that forest. I continued walking, maintaining my pace, not running but not slowing down either. I kept my eyes forward but used my peripheral vision to watch for movement in the trees. The footsteps continued, steady and patient, neither closing distance nor falling behind. Whatever was out there was not trying to hide its presence. It was letting me know I was being followed, observed, evaluated. The psychological pressure of that realization was more terrifying than any direct threat would have been. After 10 minutes of being paced, I heard a sound that made my blood turn cold. A low vocalization, not quite a growl and not quite a howl, but something in between with tonal qualities that reminded me of both wolf communication and something else I could not identify. The sound was deep enough to feel in my chest, resonant and sustained for perhaps 5 seconds before cutting off abruptly. It came from the same direction as the footsteps, confirming that whatever was following me was also vocalizing, possibly communicating with others or simply announcing its presence. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to sprint for my vehicle, to put distance between myself and whatever was tracking me through the darkening forest. But I forced myself to maintain a steady walking pace, to project calm I did not feel. Running would confirm I was prey. Running would trigger pursuit by something that could certainly move faster than I could through this terrain. The sun had fully set now. My headlamp provided a narrow cone of light that seemed pathetically inadequate against the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. I could hear my own breathing, loud and rapid despite my efforts to control it. I could hear my boots on the forest floor, each step seeming impossibly loud, and I could still hear those footsteps, those steady, patient, deliberate footsteps pacing me through the night. The creature stayed with me for another 15 minutes before the footsteps stopped. I did not hear it leave. I did not hear it change direction. The sound simply ceased, as if whatever had been following me had decided I was no longer interesting or had reached some boundary it would not cross. I kept walking, not trusting the silence, not willing to slow down until I reached my vehicle. When I finally emerged from the forest onto the dirt access road where I had parked, I ran the last 100 yards and locked myself in my truck. Only then did I allow myself to process what had happened. I sat in my truck with the doors locked and the engine running, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My headlights illuminated the edge of the forest I had just emerged from, and I found myself staring at that tree line, half expecting to see something step out into the light. Nothing appeared. The forest remained dark and still, but I could not shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something was standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, observing me with the same patient interest it had shown during the pursuit. I drove back to my field station, a small cabin I rented 40 minutes from the forest access point. During that drive, my training began to reassert itself over the primal fear that had dominated my thoughts. I started analyzing what had happened with the clinical detachment that years of scientific work had instilled. Whatever I had encountered displayed behavior that did not match any known predator in North America. The bipedal locomotion, the intelligence to pace rather than pursue, the apparent decision to follow me for a specific duration before disengaging, All of it suggested cognitive capability beyond normal animal behavior. I spent that night reviewing my photographs and camera footage, making detailed notes while the experience was fresh in my memory. The tracks I had documented were clear and measurable. The trail camera footage showed consistent patterns. The shelter site indicated repeated use and territorial behavior. I had collected data that any other researcher could examine and verify. What I did not have was an explanation that fit within accepted zoological frameworks. Over the following weeks, I returned to the forest during daylight hours only, always armed and always informing multiple people of my exact location and expected return time. I collected more camera footage, more track casts, more evidence of something occupying that territory and actively displacing the wolf pack I had been studying. The wolves continued to avoid the central zone, their movement patterns showing clear adaptation to the presence of something they recognized as a superior threat. I began researching historical accounts from the region, looking for patterns that might explain what I had encountered. What I found was a long history of reports dating back to Native American oral traditions and continuing through settler accounts, logging camp stories, and modern sightings. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across time periods and cultures. A large bipedal canine, intelligent and territorial, appearing primarily at night and displaying behavior that combined wolf-like pack dynamics with primate-level problem-solving. The folklore spoke of werewolves, of humans transforming under full moons, of curses and supernatural origins. But the evidence I had collected suggested something entirely different and far more disturbing. What if the legends were not about transformation at all? What if they were attempts by pre-scientific cultures to explain encounters with a real biological entity that did not fit their understanding of the natural world? The werewolf mythology provided a framework, a story that made the incomprehensible at least narratively coherent. But the reality, I was becoming convinced, was a creature that had evolved alongside wolves and humans, developing adaptations that made it the apex predator in environments where both species existed. I consulted with colleagues carefully, framing my questions hypothetically, describing the behavior patterns without revealing the source. The consensus among predator behavior specialists was unsettling. The stalking and pacing behavior I described matched tactics used by intelligent pack predators testing prey for weaknesses. The vocalization suggested communication capability beyond simple threat displays. The territorial marking and den site selection indicated long-term habitation rather than transient presence. Everything pointed to an established predator with cognitive abilities approaching or possibly exceeding great apes. What made this discovery so disturbing was not just the biological implications, but the behavioral ones. Werewolf legends, for all their horror elements, contained a certain comfort. They were about transformation, about humans losing control and becoming monsters temporarily. There was tragedy in those stories, but also the possibility of cure, of restoration, of the curse being broken. What I had encountered was not cursed, it was not transformed. It was simply existing as evolution had designed it, a perfect apex predator operating in forests that millions of people believed were fully cataloged and understood. The danger profile was completely different from folklore. A werewolf in legend could be stopped with silver bullets, holy water, or breaking the curse. It was bound by rules, by lunar cycles, by the mechanics of the transformation story. The creature I had encountered was bound only by the same biological imperatives that governed all predators. Territory, food, reproduction, survival. It did not transform back into a harmless human at dawn. It did not lose its intelligence when the moon waned. It remained dangerous every hour of every day, using tactics that suggested it understood human behavior and could adapt its hunting strategies accordingly. I spent months analyzing the differences between legendary werewolves and what the evidence suggested about real bipedal canines. Werewolves in folklore were tragic figures, humans trapped in monster form, often retaining some core of humanity that could be appealed to or redeemed. The creature I had encountered showed no such duality. It was not a human struggling with an animal nature. It was an animal with intelligence that allowed it to be a more effective predator. There was no humanity to appeal to, no curse to break, no transformation to wait out. It was simply there, in the forest, operating according to its nature. The psychological impact of that realization was profound. Folklore monsters, however frightening, existed within narrative structures that provided meaning and potential resolution. Real biological entities existed outside those structures. They could not be defeated by finding the right ritual or weapon. They could not be reasoned with or appealed to. They could only be respected as the dangerous apex predators they were, or encountered with consequences that depended entirely on their decision-making rather than human agency. I began documenting the behavioral patterns more systematically, creating a profile that distinguished the real creature from the folklore version. Werewolves in legend attacked during full moons following a predictable cycle. The creature I was tracking showed no lunar correlation. It was active throughout the month, with activity patterns that matched crepuscular and nocturnal hunting behavior, typical of efficient predators. Werewolves in stories often displayed frenzied, uncontrolled violence. The tracks and camera footage showed calculated, controlled movement. This was not a creature in the grip of mindless bloodlust. This was a predator using energy efficiently, moving with purpose, making tactical decisions about when to pursue and when to disengage. Werewolves in mythology could be identified by specific traits, pentagram marks, unibrows, specific physical tells. The creature I was studying could apparently move through human environments undetected when it chose to, using intelligence to avoid confrontation and documentation. The few clear sightings that existed came from chance encounters, not because the creature lacked the awareness to avoid humans, but because it occasionally chose not to. The territorial behavior was particularly revealing. Werewolves in folklore often had no permanent territory, wandering as cursed humans and only becoming dangerous during transformation periods. The evidence from the forest showed a creature with established territory, marked boundaries, preferred denning sites, and consistent patrol patterns. This was not a transient threat. This was a resident apex predator that had likely occupied that territory for years, possibly generations, while remaining undetected by wildlife management agencies and researchers. The intelligence factor was what truly separated the real creature from the legend. Werewolves in stories possessed human intelligence during their human phase, but became bestial and instinct-driven during transformation. What I had encountered showed consistent intelligence across all observed behaviors. The way it used cover while tracking me, the decision to pace rather than pursue, the apparent awareness of cameras and ability to avoid clear documentation all suggested ongoing cognitive processing that never degraded into pure instinct. And I reached a disturbing conclusion. A werewolf, bound by transformation cycles and folklore rules, would actually be less dangerous than what the evidence suggested existed in those forests. You could predict a werewolf's dangerous periods, avoid them during full moons, and prepare defenses based on established mythology. The real creature operated on its own schedule, with its own decision-making process that humans could not predict or control through ritual or legend. I presented my findings at a closed symposium for predator researchers, framing the discussion around an unnamed large predator showing unusual behavioral patterns. The response was mixed. Some colleagues dismissed the evidence as misidentification or hoax despite my credentials and documentation. Others showed intense interest, but were unwilling to pursue formal investigation due to career concerns. A few pulled me aside privately and shared their own unexplained encounters, events they had never reported because they lacked framework for understanding what they had experienced. One retired wolf biologist from Minnesota told me about an encounter in the Boundary Waters that matched my Wisconsin experience almost exactly. He had been tracking a wolf pack in the 1980s when he found himself being followed through the forest by something that paced him for over an hour before disengaging. He never saw it clearly, but the tracks he found the next day were bipedal and canine, far too large for any cataloged species. He had written it off as an anomaly, something he must have misidentified in poor light and high stress. But hearing my account brought it all back, and he admitted he had never been entirely convinced by his own rational explanations. These private conversations revealed a pattern I had not anticipated. Multiple experienced researchers had encountered something that did not fit known predator profiles, but had remained silent due to professional concerns and lack of explanatory framework. The stigma attached to cryptozoology was so strong that even credible scientists with solid evidence were unwilling to risk their reputations by reporting what they had experienced. This collective silence meant that whatever was in those forests remained unstudied, undocumented in official channels, and unknown to the public that recreated in areas where it hunted. I struggled with the ethical implications. Did the public have a right to know that apex predators with near-human intelligence potentially occupied state and national forests? Would revealing that information cause panic and lead to dangerous vigilante responses? Would official acknowledgement result in the creature being hunted to extinction before we understood its ecology and behavior? There were no easy answers, only competing responsibilities and uncertain outcomes. I continued my research, but shifted focus. Instead of trying to prove the creature's existence to skeptical colleagues, I concentrated on understanding its behavior well enough to minimize human-wildlife conflict. I worked with local hiking and camping groups informally, suggesting route modifications and safety protocols without explaining the specific reason. I monitored disappearance reports and unexplained deaths in wilderness areas, looking for patterns that might indicate predation by something other than known animals. I documented everything meticulously, building a database that future researchers might find useful if scientific attitudes ever shifted toward acceptance. The wolf pack I'd been studying eventually abandoned that territory entirely, relocating to an area 15 miles south where they established a new range. Their departure left the central corridor entirely to whatever had displaced them. I continued to monitor trail cameras in the area, collecting footage that showed the creature moving through its territory with complete confidence and apparent ownership. It no longer seemed to care about the cameras, walking past them openly as if it had determined they posed no threat. That behavioral adaptation, the shift from camera avoidance to indifference, suggested learning capability and risk assessment that I had only seen in primates and corvids. 3 years after my initial encounter, I accepted that mainstream science was not ready to acknowledge what the evidence clearly showed. The institutional resistance was too strong, the career risks too high, and the challenge to existing paradigms too fundamental. I published papers on wolf displacement behavior and predator ecology without mentioning the actual cause of the patterns I documented. I continued my work, but with the private knowledge that our understanding of North American megafauna was incomplete in ways that mattered for public safety and scientific accuracy. I think about that night in the Wisconsin forest often, about the steady footsteps pacing me through the darkness, about the intelligence I sensed in that pursuit. I think about the difference between facing a werewolf from legend and facing what I now believe was a real biological entity that has existed alongside humans for thousands of years. The werewolf would have been terrifying, but comprehensible within the narrative frameworks our cultures have developed. What I encountered was terrifying precisely because it existed outside those frameworks, because it was real and intelligent and entirely indifferent to whether humans believed in it or not. If you spend time in deep forests, particularly in regions with historical accounts of unusual predator activity, understand that the greatest dangers are not the ones from folklore. They are the ones that have learned to exist undetected, that understand human behavior well enough to avoid confrontation, and that possess intelligence that makes them far more dangerous than their physical capabilities alone would suggest. The werewolf is a story we tell to make sense of something incomprehensible. What walks on two legs through the northern forests is not a story. It is a reality that science has not yet found the courage to acknowledge. I carry that knowledge with me every time I enter the field now, a weight that has changed how I understand wilderness, and the certainty that we share these forests with something that has been watching us far longer than we have been watching for it.